back to my channel. So I'm carrying on reviewing Empire of Normality from where I left off from last time. So I just got up to the bit where I mentioned how the social model of disability arose in 1970s London. There were two physically disabled activists who argued that the disability segregation was a result of contingent historical forces, and they formed the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. Now these were Marxist disability activists, and they saw disablement as a product of material social factors rather than a mere problem with the body. This was compared to the individual or medical model, where disability is taken to be caused by impairment. So something wrong with the person's body, and this causes the person to be unable to do normal things. And it's seen as can be seen as a physiological tragedy, impeding the possibility of living a good life, and where the person will need medical treatment. Whereas the social model says that disability is something imposed on top of impairments by the way people are unnecessarily isolated. The social model rejects the causal link between bodily impairment and disablement. They acknowledge that impairment is real and part of the body, but they refused the assumption that this implied disability was an individual tragedy. They saw the problem of disability as being one of marginalisation and oppression, not simply an individual medical matter. And this was very important because it brought about legal gains, establishing disability rights in the UK, for example, ramps for physically disabled people, etc. So that's basically, the social model was very, very important in bringing these important changes, these important legislations. Very important in that regard. The medical model on its own, without taking into account societal factors, is very reductionistic. I'd argue that the social model taken to extremes is equally reductionistic, and my preferred model myself is the biopsychosocial model, which is basically a synthesis between the medical and the social model, avoiding the extremes and reductionism inherent in either approach. Like, it takes the best aspects of the social model, but it also doesn't discount intrinsic disablement either. So I think that the biopsychosocial model is the best approach because it's more balanced. And obviously each person will vary as to how their disability, as to the extent their disability is innate vis-a-vis society. There will always be a societal component because society, even in like very, very, very extreme cases, society will always, increase disability, make it like worsen someone's disablement. There's always a societal factor there, always. But denying any intrinsic innate disability can also be equally reductionistic and can end up erasing someone's experience of their embodied disability as well. So I feel we need both. So then Chapman talks about how Judy Singer's intervention, part of Judy Singer's intervention, was to clarify the insights of the early autistic activists who applied social model to neurological disability for the first time, for example, Sinclair. So first of all, there was a shift towards celebrating other forms of human diversity, for example, sexual diversity, that arose following the civil rights and pride movements. Singer posed the question, should neurological divergence be celebrated and be the locus of pride, rather than being seen as an inherently tragic deviation? So this resisted the idea that disablement stemmed from individual dysfunction. I don't get that at all. I sort of feel that's going from one extreme to another. It's almost like that resisting the idea that disability is an inherently tragic and only involves the individual. That's important to counter that, but I feel like going to the other extreme is just as problematic. And I don't understand this whole kind of celebration stuff. Like, in a way, I find that quite hurtful and problematic, particularly for people whose very disabilities have put them at an extreme disadvantage in society. Then saying, "Oh, you should celebrate it," it's kind of like a smack in the face. It's like maybe once everyone is like living a decent life, we've got a decent universal income, and I don't know, and having a disability like autism is no longer a pathway to a life of constantly living under the menace of a DWP through no fault of your own just because you happen to have this disability and you can't work. Maybe when we have a society where, I don't know, people like me who can't work through no fault of their own don't have to face that like sense of being constantly under surveillance, and are allowed to just be and like treated with respect, and there's a universal income, and you don't have to constantly justify yourself, and you get the support you need when you need it without having to constantly fight for it. Maybe then it wouldn't be quite so insulting to have these celebratory events. In the current climate, I feel it's really quite hurtful, because it's like when people are being degraded, and then you see these celebratory events celebrating autism, the very thing that's put them in this position. It's like, yeah, in an ideal society, it wouldn't put you in this position. But even in that sort of society, I still don't think I'd want to celebrate autism anyway, because even if I got everything I needed, even if there was like a universal income, you know, just given, you didn't have to worry about that about potentially your income being taken away on the whims of a right-wing government or any of that, constantly hanging over you. Maybe if like, yeah, you had everything you needed as a given, you didn't have to fight for it. Even in that society, obviously things would be a lot easier, and life would be a lot easier and not as stressful. But you still have the other stresses. You still have the other innate impediments would still be there, and I don't think I'd want to celebrate autism because it hasn't actually given me anything nice. Like, I don't get that. Like, I celebrate other things, like things I've achieved, things that I've put effort into. I don't know, not celebrate, but like, you know, I'm proud of things that I've achieved or things that I've accomplished, you know, things that I've done out of my own hard work, whatever. That's got nothing to do with my autism, that's just me. Like, I don't get that. I think they're trying to compare it to kind of like gay pride and stuff, but I think that's rather different, because obviously being gay isn't an inherent disability. Like, historically being gay obviously is a disadvantage in terms of society, and in some cultures it's still seen as a criminal offence. And a lot of pride and celebratory atmosphere around pride is all about gay people fighting oppression, but I think that's quite different to being autistic, because there's nothing wrong with being gay. It's like, not, what I mean to say is, how can I put it? There's nothing disadvantageous inherently about being gay, and yeah, I just feel that's like a different thing. Yeah, that's just how I see it. I just don't understand this whole need to like I think there's a difference though. Celebrating the gains made by disabled people is different. Like, I think disability celebration can be a valid thing when you're like celebrating fighting against oppression. I think that's genuine, and I'm all for that. Like, celebrating fighting against oppression, getting rid of right-wing, disgusting governments, all of that. Like, you know, if a universal income is brought in, like, maybe disabled people could genuinely celebrate that as like a further cause for ending economic ableism. That, I would all be before that, particularly if disabled people have spent a lot of time kind of fighting for it. That type of celebration is cool. It's all cool. I'm all for that. But the idea of actually celebrating your actual impairment, I don't get that. Like, seriously, I don't get that. I find that a bit offensive. I think that, yeah. So I see there's different types of celebration. Celebrating the gains made, you know, fighting oppression is great. All for that. But I'm not for celebrating my dysfunction, because autism hasn't given me anything positive. It's only brought me problems. So that doesn't seem kind of logical to celebrate something that's only giving me problems. You see where I'm going? Right, so that's one thing. So the other point that Singer talks about is there's a need to avoid the Satsian mistake of denying the recognition of disablement while still allowing them to push back against wrongful pathologisation and control. wrongful pathologisation and control is very, very loaded, and this is because Chapman sees psychiatry as somehow inherently linked to Galtonian eugenics. I really do not get that argument at all. Like, yes, as I've said, psychiatry has definitely had historic links to eugenics. Yes, it has been very much influenced by Galtonianism. There has been very oppressive practices in the past, very sinister practices. And there's still problems in the system today, like in certain psychiatric hospitals, you hear stories of people essentially being restrained and all sorts of horrible things going on. So it's important to be highly critical, but I don't think psychiatry itself as a discipline is inherently tarnished by Galtonianism. I just don't see that. Essentially, psychiatrists genuinely want to help people. They're in that profession because they actually care. Like most doctors, they care. They want to make people better. They generally are good people. Yes, there are bad psychiatrists out there, but most of them are good people. And there are systemic issues, but I don't think that's not to do with psychiatry itself. That's more to do with wider systemic issues in society, around underfunding and and the way and if you want to call certain practices pathologising, I suppose you could, in terms of unnecessary restraint and all of that. And obviously we mustn't whitewash it, and we must understand there are problems, but I just don't. I think it's far too reductionistic and extreme to claim that somehow psychiatry is, in today's world, tarnished by eugenics, just because it might have had links in the past. I think we have moved on more or less from that time, and I just don't see it myself as someone who has actually used mental health services for quite a number of years. I do not see that myself. I think, generally speaking, psychiatrists want to help people. Yeah, there are some bad ones, by the way. I've encountered some bad ones, just as I've encountered some rubbish social workers. You get all sorts. But I don't think it's fair to kind of claim that psychiatry itself is about pathologisation and control. I think that's a rather sweeping statement. So, I think psychiatrists get a bad rap, actually. They get an unfair bad press, and I think this is unfortunate, because like I say, psychiatry, as a field, generally wants to help people. And I think, unfortunately, they're at the cutting edge of government cuts. You know what I mean? So if anyone is to blame, it's the government, not psychiatry. I think it's government that's to blame. That's where the blame lies. Ultimately. Obviously there are some bad psychiatrists, I'm not denying that, but generally speaking, the finger of blame lies at the government. So he says it was important to keep the benefits of anti-psychiatry. I don't know what benefits of anti-psychiatry he's talking about really, while avoiding harmful aspects. It seems rather equivocal, the benefits of anti-psychiatry. I don't really see there's any benefits to anti-psychiatry at all. Anyway. Then he goes on to talk about, now that he goes on to talk about how neurodiversity came to be. The concept of neurodiversity evolved out of the concept of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is a scientific term from ecology that is seen as a vital part of what sustains broader ecosystems. The term biodiversity became very popular in the 1960s, and in the 1990s there was the idea that biodiversity should be valued and conserved. And in 1998 there was an article by someone called Bloom which posed a challenge to the concept of a normal brain. It said, neurodiversity, or neurodivergence, may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment? Now, to me, I find that rather offensive. First of all, I do not exist for the human race. I exist for... What I'm trying to say is... worth, someone's worth should never ever be reduced to their value for the human race as a whole. That to me brings to mind very sinister politics, where people who are seen as benefiting the group are prioritised over those who are seen as a burden. We must never go down that route. I think that's a really dangerous line of reasoning. It seems to me almost like the neurodiversity movement are going out of their way to try to prove the value, to try and emphasise the value of autistic people by saying that they benefit the group as a whole, by that they benefit the human species. And to me, that is just really problematic reasoning. It's almost like inverse. Ironically, it's actually inverse eugenics. Claim they're anti-eugenics, because the line of argument is inverse eugenics. Whenever you say that someone's value is contingent on their benefit to the group, you're using eugenic theory. We must not go down that route. People are worthy. People have worth because they exist. End of. Like, someone does not have to prove their worth as to how much benefit they bring to the group as a whole. They exist, therefore they have worth, I would say. Because as soon as we argue that they only have worth because they benefit the group, we are risking a eugenic argument. Even if that isn't the intent of the person using that argument, it is actually the same argument that eugenicists use. Then Chapman goes on to say that viewing different minds as having different cognitive specialisms within a broader cognitive ecosystem, for example, computer culture may favour a somewhat autistic cast of mind, very stereotyped, in contrast to the Galtonian tradition. This sees neurological diversity as vital for dealing with the complex problems humanity will encounter in a constantly changing environment. But he's employing the same Galtonian reasoning to make that point. He's basically saying that they only have value because they can provide an advantage to the species as a whole, which is eugenics. So that's ironic. Kind of double think going on there, if you ask me. I just find that rather weird reasoning. He said that eliminating neurodiversity would impede our collective functioning. Okay, now that is a really shitty argument, because aside from, I'm not going to go down the route of talking about eliminating neurodiversity and all of that, but arguing that there are all sorts of arguments of why around eliminating neurodiversity. That's a very strong word. I mean, we can't anyway. I mean, there's no way we can actually eliminate it. That's not even actually possible. But like saying that the reason for not doing so is because it would impede our collective functioning is inverted eugenics, because it's saying that it's basically saying that the only reason people with neuro issues exist is to benefit the collective functioning. I don't exist to benefit the fucking collective functioning. I'm sorry, but I don't. That to me is a fascist argument, and that makes me really angry, because we exist because we have inherent worth. And I do not like this argument. It's a very Tory, very right-wing, quite disgusting argument that people have worth because they benefit group, because otherwise you're a useless eater. Do you know what I mean? That is offensive. We exist because we exist. I exist for myself. Like, we have inherent worth. We're not here to